This series discusses crime scenes, details from autopsy and skeletal analysis, discussions of drug use, and official and media references that may use outdated language regarding a variety of social issues, including topics like immigration, housing insecurity, and sex work. Listener discretion is advised. This is the fall line. Usually, unidentified persons cases are the most open-ended of any investigation. They're just full of unknowns. Law enforcement don't know who the decedent is. If the case is a homicide, there's no clear trail of clues that leads them to the killer. That's because those things begin with the identity of the victim themselves. Though people are killed by strangers, we are more likely to be killed by those we know. And if investigators cannot identify us, how can they follow those trails in our lives? Where we work, where we live, who we love, it all matters. Where money is owed, rivalries, family conflict, abusive situations. Every piece is vital. Imagine walking backward in footprints left in dirt that take you from a person's body to the one who killed them. Those connections are built on relationships, in one way or another, on interactions. But many John and Jane Does are eventually identified. We know this. At the time of the writing of this episode, the GBI here in Georgia announced that the Jenkins County Jane Doe, a homicide victim whose case we have followed for more than 4 years, had just been identified. She is now known as Chung-eun Kim, a 28-year-old who moved from South Korea to the United States in 1981. According to the GBI, she'd been residing in Hinesville, Georgia before her death. That's about an hour and a half from Millen, Georgia, in Jenkins County, where her body was discovered in 1988. There's no word yet on who may be responsible for her murder, or whether the man who allegedly confessed all those years ago is still being investigated as a suspect. We hope that more information will become available in her case, and we'll share it as soon as we can. When information comes in Doe cases, it tends to be more like Chung-eun Kim's or like Susan Lunn's. She's the woman formerly known as Ina Jane Doe, whose case I covered in my book. A person has been identified, but a homicide case is still open, often with no immediate leads. Yet, having that identity, knowing who a person is, it's the vital first step to create that chain that we just spoke about, that links each step in the investigation together. But once in a while, things are turned upside down in the investigation. And by that, we mean that a killer is identified, sometimes even arrested and prosecuted and convicted, without their victim ever being identified. There are actually more examples of this than you might realize. Perhaps the best known example of unidentified victims of a known killer are the young John Does associated with John Wayne Gacy. Authorities have been working to identify the teenagers and young adults that were discovered on Gacy's property for years. According to A&E, when Gacy was arrested in 1978, quote, the remains of 29 victims were found in Gacy's crawlspace and yard. By 2011, 8 of those victims were still unidentified. And as of the writing of this episode, the Cook County Sheriff's Office official page states that 5 victims are still awaiting identification. Per the Cook County Sheriff's Office, quote, DNA profiles suitable for comparison have now been obtained for all 5 unidentified victims. And the Sheriff's Office specifically makes mention of the advanced techniques that they're now employing. Why has it taken so long to identify these victims? As Cook County points out, quote, after Gacy was arrested in December 1978, it was learned that some of his identified victims had never been reported missing by their families. Some families were estranged from their relative who was killed by Gacy and were unaware that the relative was missing. Also, missing persons reports from distant jurisdictions may not have found their way to investigators in Cook County, Illinois, end quote. And we found that's often the case in other situations too. In older cases, a lack of missing persons reports, distance between victim and loved ones, lack of evidence, all of that can affect the ability to identify a victim. Sometimes the killer himself has little or no knowledge of the victim's identity, and sometimes there's little investigation into the unidentified victims, especially if police already have identified victims who are the focus at trial, or if the unidentified victims are from populations who historically receive less consideration. The unhoused, the substance dependent, sex workers. This is not always the case, certainly, but often it has been. And another, perhaps less well-known example are the still unidentified victims of serial killer Maury Travis. Travis was apprehended by St. Louis, Missouri authorities in 2002 and linked to the murders of at least 12 women, whose remains were discovered in both Missouri and Illinois. According to Fox 2, of those 12 victims, 4 remain unidentified to this day. And per Fox 2, he often looked for victims in, quote, an area called The Stroll, a section of North Broadway in the Baden neighborhood. Although it was not the case for all of the women that Travis abducted and killed, some of his victims were sex workers, and some had substance dependencies. That certainly has no effect on their importance to their families, or the fact that their families may be looking for them to this day. We covered those misconceptions in our episodes on the victims of Samuel Little. But if people have become estranged or lost contact, or are living far away from their families of origin, it lessens their chances of becoming identified. And in the case of Maury Travis's victims, that may be the case, because 4 of the women who were linked to him have not been reconnected to their identities, not at the writing of this episode. And according to authorities, there may be more unidentified and missing women that have not been linked to Travis yet, but who should be. There are families who are waiting, at least 4, and maybe many, many more. So, the cases that we've brought you today fall into that rare category, solved and unsolved. Situations where the killer has confessed, but the victims' identities are still unknown. We are covering the cold cases of 3 Nashville Does in this episode, 1 John Doe and 2 Jane Does. And we have a fair amount of information to offer you in each of these cases, enough perhaps to identify each victim. But public attention is desperately needed. As always, your help will be key. On August 8, 2002, hikers who were walking a stretch of wooden field made a discovery. According to the Johnson City Press, they came upon bones and some brush, quote, behind Victory Fellowship Church in a dry creek some 100 yards into the woods. According to police reports, the area was close to Mount Olivet Cemetery, and when the area was searched, investigators discovered 2 things: further human remains and a campsite. Eventually, when they went far enough back into the woods, they located a second campsite as well. Though a second, more extensive search was conducted the next day, this time with bloodhounds, no further human remains were recovered. Per the Johnson City Press, when locals were questioned, they told Metro Nashville PD that there was a man who was known to sleep in that area by the church, but they reported that they'd not seen him in approximately a month. Though the news coverage of the discovery was limited to a few sentences, the investigation into the victim discovered behind the church was much more extensive. According to NamUs, it was eventually determined that the decedent was approximately 5'10" and between the ages of 40 and 55 years old. They estimated his remains had been behind the church for at least 6 months. A Tennessee state anthropologist examined the remains and determined that the victim had died by homicide, specifically gunshot. But in 2002, that was the extent of the information that they could discover. The case of the Mount Olivet John Doe remained cold until 2013, when a lead came in from an entirely unexpected place, a nursing home in Longview, Texas. According to Metro Nashville police files, in January of 2013, the police department in Gilmer, Texas, made contact with Nashville authorities. Apparently, a local nursing home in Longview which is about 30 miles from Gilmore in East Texas, had contacted the local police. A resident had been talking, a lot, to staff. The staff of the nursing home were concerned because this elderly resident, who was named Dan Gilmore, was insistent on confessing to a murder. According to the staff, Gilmore had grown increasingly guilty. In fact, he was depressed from the guilt, and he wanted the truth of his crime known. Once he told the story to staff, they contacted investigators who interviewed him in the nursing home. He told them that he'd been living in Tennessee back in 2002, and that while he was living there, he'd killed a man that he knew as Big Red. Gilmore was not sure of the man's real name. It was maybe Danny, but he couldn't be certain. We know that's a little confusing, with both the suspect and the victim known as Dan or Danny. While Texas authorities interviewed Gilmore, Metro Nashville PD tried to gather more information on his movements in Tennessee in hopes of matching up a possible case to his information. They were able to speak with a local who'd known Dan Gilmore, and that resident told them that Gilmore had been camping in the area around Mount Olivet Cemetery around 2002. He described Gilmore as someone, quote, with a quick temper and as a loner who carried a .22 revolver that he kept in his front left pocket. As Metro Nashville reviewed their open homicide files, they came upon the case of the Mount Olivet John Doe. Then, when investigators called the medical examiner's office to ask for their reports and the anthropology results, there was even more information, a notation of a possible identity. The full file included a fax form from a detective with information regarding a possible name, Danny Peters. The 2013 investigator had found a Danny Peters in their system, a white male born in 1961 who'd been arrested in 1984. With this information in hand, the new Nashville investigator contacted his counterpart in Gilmore, who sat down with Dan Gilmore for another interview. She actually arranged a series of photos for Gilmore, with Danny Peters' booking photo included, in hopes that he could pick it out of the lineup. But the elderly man could not pick out a particular individual from the photos. He did, however, provide the investigator with more information. He drew her a map of the Mount Olivet campsite area as it had been in 2002 and told her that, if he remembered correctly, that Dan from Tennessee had, quote, been born in Germany. By February of 2013, Nashville investigators had arranged to travel to East Texas to conduct their own interviews. They met with Dan Gilmore at the nursing home, where he agreed to be recorded, and indicated that he understood he was speaking with police in regard to a homicide investigation. He told them that he'd moved to Nashville in about 1982. He'd worked various jobs and had stable housing for some time, but by the mid-'80s, he was unhoused and, quote, lived in the woods in the general area near the Mount Olivet Cemetery. He said that he'd chosen that area because it was near to his place of employment. Apparently, Gilmore had issues with several people in the area and expressed that he had the desire to kill at least one other man prior to meeting Danny. Gilmore told investigators that he'd met Red, or Danny, in the early to mid-1980s. He said that Danny, quote, sometimes worked through the labor force but never had a steady job. Gilmore didn't detail how acrimonious their relationship had been in the past, but he did say that he had serious issues in April of 2002. He said that he had attacked and killed Red on April 8th of that year, a day he said that they'd gotten into a serious argument. Gilmore claimed that Red had threatened him first, that he said he was going to burn Gilmore's tent down with Gilmore inside it, and that's why Gilmore explained that he'd gone and gotten a shotgun. He didn't say from where, and he never used the .22 that his old acquaintance had told police about. But he told investigators that he obtained, quote, a single-shot 12-gauge shotgun, and that he took Red by surprise while the other man was sitting down. It was early afternoon, and they were totally alone. After Red was dead, he obscured him with branches and brush, and he threw the gun in a creek close to camp. When human remains were eventually found behind the church, Gilmore said that he'd left the state. We aren't sure how he finally ended up in that East Texas nursing home, but Gilmore indicated that he confessed to Red's murder at least once before. But at the same time, he'd been diagnosed with a mental illness because he'd also told authorities that he'd been hearing voices. He didn't think that the confession had been taken seriously because of that coinciding factor. Gilmore was able to provide Nashville investigators with a few more possible identifying details about Red, assuming that his memory was accurate. As we already mentioned, Gilmore recalled that Red's first name was Dan or Danny, and that he thought he was probably in his mid-40s in 2002. Gilmore also recalled that, as we noted earlier, Red said he was originally from Germany, but, quote, Gilmore doubted that because he stated that Red couldn't speak German. Red had also told him that, quote, he was in the military in Germany and that he had a daughter in Houston. Apparently, Red and his daughter maintained some level of contact because Gilmore said, quote, she wanted him to go into an assisted living center. According to Detective Filter's research, which began in 2020, there is some evidence that a Danny Peters with similar identifying features lived in Tennessee in 1978. He was able to locate a yearbook from the Tennessee Preparatory School, dated 1978, that included a photo and birthplace of Stuttgart, Germany. He also, quote, may have had family in the Army since he had a Kentucky Social Security number and was born in Stuttgart, where there is an Army base. But unfortunately, those records weren't immediately available for review, so requests had to be placed, as well as requests as to whether the Tennessee Preparatory School had maintained any detailed student files dating back to the 1970s. It turned out that soldiers' information was available, but that Detective Filter would need a full name of the service member, not the relative of the service member, in order to locate such a file. So that was a roadblock. And the school records, they were not available either. When we sat down with Detective Filter to discuss this case, we started with a few questions that we thought listeners might have, first and foremost about Dan Gilmore, who confessed to the crime. We've been given permission to use his name because it might ring a bell with someone who could provide further information. And we understand that listeners may have questions regarding his status, because he did continue to remain in Texas, in nursing facilities, after his confession. Can you talk to us about special decisions that are made regarding things like extradition, etc., when you have confessions that come in from someone who is elderly or very sick and living out of state and or is already in some state of incarceration? How do you weigh your interest in information versus pursuing legal charges? And how did that apply in this case?
In this particular case, the suspect, Dan Gilmore, was sick and wasn't believed to be around much longer. The district attorney is the one who makes the call on whether or not to prosecute a case based on the unique circumstances. The district attorney is also the one that has to approve the extradition. In this case, since the victim was unknown and the family of the victim was unknown, and the suspect was nearing death and in a facility where he was not going to be able to harm anyone else, I believe the district attorney decided to wait regarding charging Dan Gilmore.
You did quite a lot to try and track down background information on the man possibly known as Danny Peters. Can you talk to us about some of those measures and where you ran into dead ends?
The original detective had uncovered some information about Danny Peters. I requested the help of NamUs to do analytical research for me. I attempted to get records through the U.S. Army since his father was allegedly in the Army. I was told that unless I had the name of the soldier, there was no way for them to find information on related family members. I also attempted to get the school records through the state archives, and I was informed the school records for the time period I was inquiring were destroyed during the 2010 flood here in Nashville.
Metro Nashville PD has begun to work with Othram Labs to identify the Mount Olivet John Doe, but we need your help to try and confirm or rule out the possibility that he may be Danny Peters. Danny Peters would likely have been born in the early 1960s in Germany and possibly to a military family. He may have attended the Tennessee Preparatory School in Nashville and would have been in high school in 1978. His mid-1980s booking photo, which we have permission to share, is on our social media. He's a red-haired white male with blue eyes. His hair is curly, and he's listed as 6 feet tall and 170 pounds at the time of arrest. He was unhoused at the time of arrest, but he did have a vehicle. It was noted in the booking report that he was residing in his car at the time. The make and model are not listed. If you have any information about Danny Peters, or had relatives in Nashville who had a similar background, who'd been stationed in Germany and had spent time in Kentucky before coming to Tennessee, you may have information that could be helpful in this case. Please reach out to Metro Nashville PD at the number we provide at the end of the episode. You can also find it right now in our show notes. In 1984, just about 3 hours west of Nashville, a man named James Mitchell Schaefer was paroled after 13 years. Per the commercial appeal, he'd been convicted of rape in Shelby County, Tennessee in 1971. Then, on July 24th, 1985, the Tennessean reported that a 47-year-old man named James Mitchell Schaefer, who then resided on Charlotte Avenue, had been charged with kidnapping. According to the paper, a woman named Lisa Anderson reported the incident. Schaefer had, quote, picked up Anderson on Dickinson Road under the pretense that he wanted to take nude photos of her. When they arrived at Schaefer's rental house on Charlotte Avenue, all seemed fine at first. But Schaefer waited until Lisa was distracted and then surprised her with a knife and overpowered her. Though Schaefer bound Lisa, she managed to break through the duct tape that he'd used, and she, quote, broke through a window in the house and went to the police. Per the Tennessean, Schaefer was, quote, charged with kidnapping. But when Lisa Anderson did not show up for her court date, the charges were dropped. And then, 2 years later, in Kentucky, the Democrat and leader reported that a man named James Mitchell Schaefer, a local, had been arrested for kidnapping and sexually assaulting an adolescent male. He'd kidnapped the boy near the local middle school at gunpoint. He was held on $100,000 bond and eventually convicted. According to the leader, he was sentenced to 20 years. Just 2 months later, back in Nashville, there was crime scene tape up around a rental house on Charlotte Avenue. It was nighttime, and per the Tennessean, police had been called much earlier in the day when one of the current residents had ventured down into the basement. The details are not provided in the paper, but that resident had seen something, seen enough to be very frightened. And that resident had been right. By late in the night on November 17th, Metro Nashville PD had discovered 2 shallow graves and skeletal human remains. It was still early, but experts who came to the scene said that the victims appeared to be 2 adult women. Assistant Chief Sherman Nichols told reporters that there were no suspects, but they were looking into former residents. It was apparent, though, that the media were already aware of James Mitchell Schaefer, a former resident. They definitely knew about his 1985 kidnapping charge because a reporter directly asked the assistant chief. Per the Tennessean, Nichols said that the department was, quote, looking into everything. Locals told the Tennessean that Schaefer had moved shortly after the case against him had been dismissed. The next media mention that we could find of James Mitchell Schaefer came in November of 1984, when the headlines led with his name. A Kentucky prisoner had confessed to 2 Nashville murders. They'd figured out that James Mitchell Schaefer was living on Charlotte Avenue in 1985, but he'd been there in 1984, too. And Lisa Anderson, she was not the first woman that he had attacked. At first, Schaefer only told the papers that those 2 women had tried to rob him. He didn't know who they were, but eventually, more accurate stories ran. He knew a little of who they were. He said that he'd always planned to kill them. The media also discovered why his surviving victim, Lisa Anderson, had not made an appearance in court. Lisa, and that was an alias she used, the Tennessean noted, had not missed her court date willingly. She'd been in jail on forgery charges when the case was dropped. So, she'd been literally unable to appear in court. The story that unfolds between official documentation and media reports seems to include enough details that someone, somewhere, should have recognized the two unidentified victims. And there were clues that perhaps could have led to their identities, but those identifications never came. And somewhere, there are two families who've been missing their loved ones since the mid-1980s. We'll start there, with what James Mitchell Schaefer told investigators of the events and what they pieced together themselves. Detective Filter inherited this case decades later, but he'll be able to weigh in too. When Nashville detectives traveled to Kentucky to interview Schaefer, he told them about his background and then led into the events of 1984 and 1985. He said that he was born in Memphis in 1940 and was first incarcerated at 15 years old for 5 years. Then he was arrested again in 1963 and spent another 8 years in prison. The reports don't specify those charges, though we know that his next conviction, which came the same year he was released, was in 1971. As we told you, after serving 13 years of that sentence, he moved to Nashville in 1984, to the house on Charlotte Avenue. We wanted to know more about the Charlotte Avenue area and Charlotte Pike as it was then, so we spoke with Detective Filter about the area. We also asked him about the two roads, Broadway and Jefferson, where Schaefer picked up his two victims.
This house sat on Charlotte Pike, which is a part of US Highway 70 on the west side of Nashville. It was a 4-lane highway, the same as it is today. The area right around the house appeared to be mostly residential single-family homes in 1987. Today, there are a few more businesses, and most of the single-family homes have been knocked down and replaced with apartments or condos. Broadway had several strip clubs, porn shops, peep shows, unlike now, where it is basically 4 blocks of nothing but honky-tonks. What is now known as the entertainment district in Nashville was actually part of the red light district back in the 1980s. The second victim was picked up on Jefferson Street, which is north of downtown. This area also had a lot of prostitution in the 1980s and 1990s.
Shaver spent a lot of time both on Broadway and Jefferson, and he was able to move freely, without much notice, through the city. Though some people in his life did take notice of his drinking and his occasional strange behavior. That was evident when police later interviewed his co-workers at a local furniture store. Apparently, when the attack on Lisa Anderson occurred in 1985, he was still on parole. When he was arrested, that parole was briefly revoked. However, when she failed to appear, the Tennessean reported, it was reinstated. Being on parole, though, hadn't made him afraid. Lisa was not the first woman that he'd hurt. In fact, by that point, he'd committed murder, twice. Before his attack on Lisa, the same year, in 1985, Schaefer had killed a woman, and it was not the first time. According to him, his first murder had taken place in 1984. He told police that he'd been planning on committing homicide for some time. He was specifically targeting sex workers who worked in the Broadway Street area of Nashville. He'd planned on Lisa as his third victim. Schaefer said that both of the women whose remains had been discovered in the basement were sex workers. He said he knew them as Sheila Cummings and as Little Bit. According to Schaefer, they were both black women, and this bore out the analysis performed by the state's anthropologists. Schaefer said that he met Sheila on April 21st, 1984, and that she agreed to return with him to Charlotte Avenue. Schaefer also claimed that he caught Sheila, quote, stealing money from his wallet, something that he told the press, too, a number of times, and that then he attacked her, which led to her death. There's no proof of that stealing, though, except for his word. And that is the word of a man who said he'd planned to commit homicide long before Sheila ever entered his home. Schaefer did not provide a description of Sheila, but experts estimated that she was 25 to 35 years old at the time of her death. She was not found with her clothing when the basement graves were discovered. She may have worn a lady's gold Elgin watch and a ring set with an amber stone. Those items were found with her remains. Sheila was likely around 5'9" tall, and she had her fingernails painted red and yellow at the time of her death. Schaefer said that he'd met the woman he knew as Little Bit the next year, on or around July 4th of 1985. This time, he said, he was driving down Jefferson Street when he saw her and asked her to come to his house. Although he'd first claimed that she tried to rob him, he later told police that he attacked her in bed. She had no idea that she was in danger. Based on Schaefer's description and what was discovered at the scene, Little Bit was wearing a blue top and blue shorts. She may have worn a ring with a Grim Reaper embossed on it. One was found with her remains. According to the expert examination, Little Bit was probably around 5'6", and she likely had a broken nose during her lifetime, as well as a broken finger, probably on her left hand, but both would have healed well before her death. She was likely 25 to 35 years old, and Little Bit had fairly extensive dental work, including restorations and extractions, and a fairly recent extraction of tooth 14. That's her upper left molar. Little Bit also had an open-faced gold overlay on tooth 7. That's her upper right lateral incisor. Though Schaefer didn't know it, it seems likely that Sheila and Little Bit knew each other and were likely friends. According to police files, a Clarksville, Tennessee motel owner saw the news on TV and called Metro Nashville PD. She said that she recognized the details of the case, and she confirmed that she knew both women, who she also knew as Sheila and Little Bit. The motel owner said that they regularly stayed at the motel, along with a man named Allen, and that they worked in the Fort Campbell area as well as in Nashville. The motel owner thought that Little Bit's last name might be Johnson, and that, quote, she had a large gold tooth in the front. She said that they often stayed with a third woman named Lisa. There's no indication in the file as to whether that woman was Lisa Anderson. The motel owner said that she was pretty sure that the women were originally from Chattanooga, Tennessee. Records do show that Metro Nashville contacted the Clarksville police, where the motel was located, for more potential information on this tip. But we aren't sure what, if any, further leads they were able to provide. We also aren't sure what contact they had with Chattanooga authorities, if any. There was another avenue, though, to identifying Sheila. Schaefer told authorities that she'd had her own vehicle when he met her, and that she'd actually driven to his house. After her death, he was nervous that his neighbors would notice her car, so he'd driven it all the way to Chattanooga, that's about 2 hours, and left it near a bus station, and then he'd taken the Greyhound back to Nashville. He described her car as a black 1970 to 1972 Ford LTD. That information could narrow down who Sheila was, particularly if she was using her real name. If her car was registered, then it could lead authorities directly to her identity. We don't know precisely how far that lead was followed, but it seems that her car was not discovered in 1987. Though the murders of Sheila and Little Bit were followed in the press, and so was Schaefer's trial, no one came forward with a lead that could identify them, and we did not find evidence of missing persons reports that were considered possible matches at the time. James Schaefer was convicted February of 1990 on 2 counts of murder, without his victims' identities having ever been discovered. Schaefer had initially submitted a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, but, per the Tennessean, shifted his plea to avoid the death penalty. Schaefer died while in prison in October of 2004. Back at the beginning, when Schaefer was arrested, he said, according to the Commercial Appeal, that he, quote, confessed so they'd have a Christian burial, and their relatives' minds would be at ease, once and for all. But we find that hard to believe. He confessed when he was caught, and then retracted his confessions, and then confessed again. He seemed to enjoy sharing the details of the crimes with reporters who managed to speak with him. He didn't care about his victims' families or who his victims were. He certainly had done little to help investigators identify them. He had killed both women because he thought he could get away with it, and he'd planned on doing it again. During his time in Nashville, James Mitchell Schaefer almost exclusively sought out the services of Black sex workers, both cis and trans women. This was according to one of his acquaintances from the furniture store where he worked as a night watchman. In terms of physical description, Schaefer was a thin, white man in his 40s, and he wore glasses and had a receding hairline. We will have a photo of him to share on our social media. We mention all of this for two reasons: victimology and possible witnesses. There may be someone who was living or working in Nashville at that time who will recognize this description of Schaefer, or who had friends working in the industry at that time. His picture may be familiar, or they may recall details of his activities because he was consistently known to be violent with sex workers. They may have some information that could help to identify other people who had encounters with him. Schaefer told police that there were a number of increasingly violent incidents and attacks preceding the murders of Sheila and Little Bit, and then there was the attempted murder of Lisa Anderson, too. Maybe someone out there will remember Sheila or Little Bit, and if there are other crimes that could be tied to Schaefer, authorities need to know. If other women, especially those who matched his victim profile, went missing around the time he was free and in Nashville, reporting that information is vital. Recently, we spoke with Detective Filter about the cases of Sheila and Little Bit, and he told us as much as he's been able to determine so far. He's just recently on the case, but he is working with several officers to gather more information. In the case of the Jane Does found in the basement, we're in an unusual position in that we not only have a convicted perpetrator, but that also he gave us details concerning the victims. Schaefer gives us a first and last name, possible, for the decedent that he called Sheila Cummings. And he mentions that she had a car, which he says he drove to Chattanooga and abandoned in 1987. In 1987, how would these leads have been followed up on, to your knowledge?
The leads would have been followed up on much the same as they are today. The detectives would have gotten the vehicle information from the state if available and contacted Chattanooga police to help locate the car if it hadn't been discovered already. I would have also tried to get the bus information, which should have been obtainable.
If you were investigating a similar case today, how would you go about trying to identify the victims? And what would you have liked to see in the file when you received it in terms of background information that could help you now?
I would approach it in much the same fashion. I would have researched the history of the house and who had been living there in an attempt to connect the victim with the suspect. Unfortunately, in this case, the victims and suspect did not have a particular connection. The decedents were really just victims of opportunity. I wish there was more follow up work documented as far as interviewing other prostitutes and information on the one victim's vehicle. That could have likely been a big lead in identifying one of them. I can think of several things I would do today, but looking back at 1987, they didn't have the access to information we have now. That would have made things such as locating the car in Chattanooga a much more difficult task.
In your opinion, what is our best chance of identifying these women today? What information in your mind do we need to communicate to the public?
I believe our best chance for identifying these women is going to be through public information. There are people out there that knew these women and knew they disappeared. If they were afraid to come forward in the 1980s, that fear should be long gone by now. And if there is a family out there that had someone working in the sex trade in Nashville in the 1980s and they haven't heard from them since, those are the people we need to talk to. It's going to take information to connect the dots within the timeline to figure out who these women are.
This is particularly vital because, at the present time, the two victims' remains are not available for analysis or for testing. There are current efforts underway to identify the location of their skeletal remains so that DNA testing can be completed. But if there is a missing person who may be a match for Sheila or for Little Bit, a comparison can still be done because their dental charts are on file and there are extensive notations regarding their injuries in life. Unfortunately, there is no forensic art, but with so much information, we hope that it will be enough to trigger a memory in someone. It's important to note that Sheila Cummings might not be Sheila's real name. It could be a fully invented alias, or her name could be something close to Sheila Cummings, or it might be a married last name. If her family had lost contact, they might not know her by it. As for Little Bit, we've had less to work with, just the possible last name of Johnson, but we know that both women either were from Chattanooga or lived there for a significant period of time. They will likely have had friends or family from that area and who would have noted their absence in 1984 and 1985. It's a place to start. We have been looking through birth records, marriage records, school yearbooks, arrest logs, pretty much anything you can think of, searching for them. But nothing is more valuable than getting information in front of someone who is a relative or a friend. They will recognize things that we don't. We can search for years and never find the answer that they will see in an instant. That's why it's so vital that you share these episodes and the information we'll be posting on social media. And if you recognize anything about these stories, that you contact Metro Nashville PD. If you have any information concerning the homicide victims we have discussed, please reach out. The man known as Danny Peters, or Red, was likely born in Germany and may have had family in the armed services. He likely attended Tennessee Preparatory School and may have had a daughter living in Houston in the early 2000s. He was about 6 feet tall and had red hair and blue eyes. The woman known as Sheila Cummings would have been between 20 and 35 years old in 1984, most likely around 25, and about 5'9". She probably wore a ring with an amber stone and a gold watch, and lived in Chattanooga for some time. She drove a black 70 to 72 Ford LTD. Little Bit may have had the last name Johnson. She was between 25 and 35, around 5'6", and may have worn a Grim Reaper ring, and she had significant dental restoration. She had an open-faced gold cap that would have been visible when she smiled. She likely broke her nose and her finger during life, and likely lived in Chattanooga for some time. Please contact Detective Matthew Filter at Metro Nashville Police at 615-862-7803. You can also call Nashville Crime Stoppers at 615-74-CRIME or 7463. Callers can remain anonymous and may qualify for a cash reward. Next time on The Fall Line, we look at Doe cases in Nashville where the victims were discovered only moments or hours after death. Join us then to help us get these cases out and in front of the people who can help. If you know of a case that should be covered on The Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is an independently produced show, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIAs, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. And if you try out the products we advertise, please use our sponsor codes. It really helps. And take a moment to rate and review our show on your podcast app of choice. My book, Lay Them to Rest, which covers years of my life working on a Jane Doe case and the world of forensic scientists who resolve unidentified persons cases, is out everywhere now as hardcover, ebook, and audiobook, read by me. You can order it anywhere you get books and through your local library. Find out more through the link in our show notes. And if you'd like to support the show and the stories we cover, join us on Patreon or Apple Premium. 100% of our Patreon and Apple Premium earnings are supporting our Family Therapy Fund and actively paying for therapy for families who've appeared on the show. On Patreon, you can get early release, ad-free versions of our regular episodes for $5 a month. Or if you prefer Apple Premium, you can subscribe there as well. On Patreon, We also post occasional giveaways, updates, and blogs, which all patrons can enjoy, starting at just $1. The Follow Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laurah Norton, with additional research assistance from Brian Werters and Anna Luria. Interviews by Brooke Hargrove. Produced, engineered, and scored by Maura Curry. Content advisement by Brandy C. Williams. And, as always, our most special thanks to Liz Lipka.